Welcome to the third episode of the Reti Nimzo Larsen Speedrun series here. In this third episode, we are going to be playing against players in the rating range of 800 to 900. And in the three games you'll be seeing during this video, you're going to be seeing situations where my opponents continue to give away free pawns in the center of the board. You'll also see in the very first game that there's going to be a good in-depth explanation as to some of the move order nuances when we're playing the Reti Nimzo Larsen, so you'll definitely want to be on the lookout for that particular explanation. You'll also see a game example where we focus on exploiting a kind of strong use of the bishop on b2, being very useful along the open diagonal, aiming towards the opponent's king side. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the first game. So we're continuing along with our Reti Nimzo Larsen speedrun. We go for knight f3. We're playing against Rio Indigo, rated 827 from Spain here. So knight f3, d5, one of the most common moves that you'll face when you're playing this repertoire. So we're continuing, of course, with our move b3, getting ready to put the bishop on the b2 square. And here black goes for the move c5. So it is actually very important in this position with this specific move order that we need to be careful with our move order as white here. So it's actually very important, instead of playing the move bishop to b2 in this position right away, you actually want to play the move pawn to e3 here. The reason behind this is that if you go bishop to b2 right away, black does have the possibility here of playing the move f6, which looks very weird, but the idea for black is to put a third pawn in the center of the board. They want to play the move pawn to e5. And if they play the move f6 next, there's really not a whole lot we can do to prevent them from playing the pawn up to the e5 square, if we put the bishop on b2 right away. For this reason, it's actually very important to play the move pawn to e3 first here in this position, so that if black does play the move f6, which they're not doing, but if they had played the move f6, we were going to be able to play our pawn to the d4 square. They might take us, we recapture with the pawn, and our pawn on d4 would make it more difficult for black to play the move pawn to e5. So this is actually a very important move order. It is covered in the Chessable course. If black goes for an early d5, c5, you want to play e3 before you put the bishop on b2 in this specific case. Now that we've already played the move e3, now we can go ahead and continue with bishop to b2. We don't want to let black play e5 for free. We are now covering that square. And as we've seen in other parts of the speedrun, a lot of players are putting their pawn on e5 and just letting us capture it, whether it's on the very first move of the game, which we've seen in some of the other games, or in this case on move number 4, we have two pieces aiming for the e5 square. They only have one piece protecting it, and so we are able to grab the pawn in the center of the board. So it's been a pretty consistent trend. At this rating level, you're really going to see a lot of people who just give you this e5 pawn. They let you take it. Again, whether it's on the first move, the second move, in this case the fourth move, we're able to just win a pawn in the center of the board for free without any fight. Now, black here is playing the move bishop d6. This is also a very common mistake that you'll see at this rating level. They're developing a piece, but they're leaving the pawn on g7 undefended. And so we are going to grab the pawn on g7. The rook in the corner is also going to be captured. It is trapped at this point. And I'm going to assume as we continue further along in the speedrun and play tougher opponents, stuff like this won't be happening so routinely, but we saw it in the 600 rating range. We saw it in the 700 rating range. We're all the way up in the 800 rating range, and our opponents are still giving us free pawns on e5. They're letting us take on g7. We're winning the rooks in the corner of the board on h8 pretty routinely. And yeah, now it's just up to us to convert this gigantic material advantage that we have. We're up 2 pawns and a rook. So here black played king to d7. They are attacking our bishop on h8. Probably the simplest thing here is just to go ahead and take the knight and trade pieces. I do think it's also playable to play bishop g7 if you want to kind of keep the bishop alive for a bit longer. I don't really think there's anything too wrong with that, but I'm going to go ahead and just trade pieces. Let's take on f6. Black is going to recapture. And yeah, because we're up a rook and 2 pawns, we're very, very happy to just trade stuff at this point. The more pieces that come off the board, the more likely we are to win the game, especially the closer it gets to the endgame phase. So here we have to be a bit careful. Black is threatening the rook on a1. even though we're up a whole rook and 2 pawns, you don't want to just fall asleep at the wheel and just, completely ignore what your opponents are doing with their own moves. I do have a couple of different checks that are available on b5 or g4, but I think the king will just move away to c7, and I don't really see a ton of benefit for that. So I think what I'm going to do instead is develop a new piece, hit the pawn on d5. Here black plays the move bishop to e5. They are lining up towards the knight. So if the knight moves away, we do have to be a bit careful that they're not going to just capture the rook in the corner. That being said, I think it is possible to grab the pawn on d5 because we are attacking the queen at that point. The queen's going to have to move away somewhere, so maybe we take the pawn, they move the queen. We can always move the knight back to c3 if all else fails, and I think we are able to just grab a pawn at that point. I don't see any kind of counter-attacking move that would overly bother us if we do take the pawn. So, with that being the case, we have such a large threat of taking their queen that they have to react to it. I think we're going to go ahead and just grab the pawn, and then probably move the knight back to safety next move to save the knight and the rook simultaneously. I'm going to assume, okay, they go back to g7, so they're not really counter-attacking the knight, but they do still maintain the threat on the rook. So that's something we need to be cautious about. Now, because the queen stayed on the same diagonal as the bishop, I don't know if going back to c3 is all that great. I guess in the grand scheme of things, if they do take the knight and we recapture, we are opening up a discovered check on the king, so maybe it is fine to just go back to c3. It might also be fine just to put the pawn on c3 and just blunt the entire diagonal. That seems like a perfectly good move as well. Even pawn to d4 is looking pretty good here, because if we can open up the center of the board towards the opponent's king, then that's going to be pretty good when their king is, on this kind of awkward d7 square. So c3 looks good. d4 is actually looking pretty good. Which one are we going to go for? I think I'm going to go for the d4 move. I think this is going to be a bit more proactive. If they do trade the pawns and take with the bishop, then I will play the move pawn to c3, and then there will be some trouble with the bishop and the king being lined up on the same file when our queen is going to be targeting both things at the same time. So let's take back, attack the bishop. I'm going to assume they're taking it. But now I have the move pawn to c3, and if this bishop moves away, they're always going to have to be concerned about the discovered checks that will be available there. So I will push the pawn. If they take, I will recapture with the knight, and the big problem for them is there's going to be this discovered check on the king. So black probably thinks they're going to be able to take the knight here, but because of the check that I am making at this point, they are not able to take the knight since their king is being checked first, essentially. So they move the king away. So now I have a number of moves that are good. I can check with the knight on a couple of different squares. I can put a rook on c1 to line up towards the king. I think knight to b5 is looking very strong here. I think the king is running very low on squares when we kind of use the combination of the knight and the queen to attack it. So I'm leaning towards knight b5. I'm assuming the king has to go to the b6 square, I believe. And after something like queen to d6 check, king to a5, it's very close to a checkmate. I'm not entirely sure if there's one there right away, but I think I'm going to start with that anyways. Let's go knight to b5 and give the check. If the king goes to b8, d6 is mate. If it goes to c6, d6 would have been mate. So it goes up to the b6 square. So queen d6 check, king a5, b4 check, king a4. Feels close to a mate, but I'm not seeing the exact finishing move just yet. I think I'm still going to start with this check anyways. I'm also making sure that black cannot check on the e5 square later on down the road, so I'm keeping that square covered. They have to go up to the a5 square. And then I might just move the rook into the game. If I'm not seeing an immediate mate here, I might just play a move like rook c1. What you don't want to do here is get so tunnel visioned on the king, assuming you don't see a mate. Like, if you see a mate, you should do it, of course. But if you don't see a mate and you get so tunnel visioned on the king, you might miss that the rook on a1 is still being attacked here. So I'm not seeing a mate here. I very well could be missing one. Maybe queen c7 check is a good move here. They go b6. If I check on c3, we trade the queens. I think I'm going to just go ahead and play, let's do rook to d1. There's no check on c3. The knight covers that. And now I'm threatening queen a3 check. King moves, rook to d6 would be checkmate. So black needs to do something about that. They don't have any checks of their own that they can give. We cover both of these checks by our knight and our queen. And now queen a3 followed by rook to d6 is the checkmate threat. So bishop g4 doesn't really deal with that. I think I can just go back to a3. King moves up, or I guess backwards. And then rook to d6 is the checkmate in this position here. Okay, so we got the win on this one. Let's go ahead and backtrack a little bit to analyze it here. So in this particular game, knight f3, d5, b3, c5. So as I mentioned during the game here, it's very important that we don't rush with bishop to b2 against this d5, c5 setup. I've actually played this as black quite a few times against the Reti Nimzo Larsen, and there are a lot of people who kind of autopilot in this position. They go for bishop to b2, and then black plays f6. And now it's really hard to prevent black from playing the move e5 here. If you try to play d4, the difference is because you don't have a pawn on e3 yet, black can take the pawn on d4, then play e5, and black gets the 2 pawns in the center, and pretty much we're always trying to prevent this from happening when we're playing the Reti Nimzo Larsen. We're really trying to make it difficult for black to get the pawn on e5. Almost every variation that you'll see throughout the speedrun, if black is ever trying to play e5 with their next move, I'm going to always try to play d4 or something that's going to prevent that from happening easily. So that's essentially the setup. You know, when we have the knight on f3, the bishop on b2, potentially a pawn on d4, we're really trying to make it very difficult for black to get a pawn on the e5 square. If they get a pawn on e5, something has probably gone wrong in the opening, is the way I would put it. And this is also one of the big differences between starting off with knight f3 versus starting off with pawn to b3. In one of the YouTube comments on one of the previous videos, somebody asked, you know, why, if we're going for knight f3 and b3, why don't we just start with b3 in the first place? If you start with b3, it's totally fine to play this, but you are giving black the chance of putting a pawn on e5 right at the start, which again is totally playable for white. But the way I'm recommending things in this particular repertoire that I'll be playing throughout the speedrun series is that we're trying really hard to not let black play e5. And if they do play e5, we want to be able to win the pawn, as we saw in this game, or we want to be able to like punish it in some way. So this is why autopiloting with bishop to b2 would not be ideal here, because f6 to e5 actually gives us some trouble. If you go e3 first, which is what happened in the game, if black tries the same f6 move now, the difference is we can play d4 this time, stopping black from playing e5 because we are going to win a pawn if they do that. And if they take the pawn, we have the e3 pawn to recapture with rather than needing to take with the knight or the bishop. And now we are still preventing black from playing the e5 move. So if we can stop them from playing e5, then the pawn on f6 looks a bit silly. Now the knight can't move to f6. You know, black will have to, you know, develop the bishop, put the knight on e7, like stuff like that looks a little bit awkward for sure. And so that's a big difference between playing bishop to b2 right away and when they get to play f6 d4, or sorry, f6 e5 versus playing e3 first. I'll also point out real quick what happens if black tries to play f6 on the second move of the game. If they play f6 on move number 2, we are still playing d4 to prevent that e5 move. And the difference is there's no c5 pawn taking us on d4 just yet. So as we continue up the rating ladder, you know, my explanations and on the openings will get a little bit more in depth for sure, especially as players play more solid options in the opening phase and aren't just giving us free pawns as we see in this game. But so I wanted to give you some of the background information as to why we're not just going bishop b2 and just autopiloting there. We're actually playing e3 first in this version of things, and then bishop to b2. Now, in the game, black just gave us a free pawn. He played e5, this is not safe to go for. We take this, and then we also get to take the pawn on g7. And you'll see this a lot of times in your own games if you're at this rating level. Players are going to give up the e5 pawn for free, and then they might also make the mistake of leaving the g7 pawn undefended. If they had played bishop to e7, it would have been the same thing. We can still take the pawn on g7 in a position like this. So black lost the pawn, lost a second pawn, lost the rook, and then from here it's all about just converting our material advantage. We don't need to do anything overly fancy. In the game, that kind of ends up that we did go for a nice attack that eventually led to checkmate, but if you wanted to play it safe here, you could also play something like pawn to c3, develop the pieces, and just be happy with your extra rook that you have. I decided to play a little bit more ambitiously. I picked up another pawn in the center, started to attack and opened up the middle of the board, and mainly we're trying to take advantage of black's king that's misplaced on the d7 square. One material. I didn't see a checkmate here. Apparently the computer's pointing out there's a mate in 5. I don't exactly know what it is, quite honestly. I can flip on the engine lines here. It says queen to d2, queen to c7. Okay, I suppose now that I'm maybe seeing the move, yeah, I guess you can go queen to c7. I suppose b4. Was it b4? I'm not even sure. Yeah, I guess king takes d6. Then you kind of go back to d6 and a3. Okay, so the big, okay, there might have been a little bit of a quicker mate that was available here in the game. I think rook d1 looks good enough, and it did lead to a checkmate pretty quickly after that. All right, so that's it for this game. Let's get into the next one. All right, so we have our next game here, playing against EDD 325 from the Dominican Republic. We're playing white, so of course we start off with knight f3. And the plan is to go for b3. So knight f6 is another one of the most common moves you'll see. In the previous game, we saw d5 on move 1. Knight f6 is also a very, very common move on the first move of the game. I would generally say that d5 and knight f6 are going to be the two most common moves that you will see in your own games, especially as you kind of climb up the rating ladder a bit more. c5 is also popular, g6 is popular, but these two moves, controlling more of the center of the board, are usually the most common moves in the position. So we are going to continue with b3. Black has not let us play the move e4, so we are going to go ahead and just prioritize getting the bishop to the b2 square. Get rid of that. Okay, so here black plays the move knight to c6 in this position. So they do have the potential idea of playing a pawn to e5 in this position, and we, as mentioned in the previous game, we don't want to let our opponents do that. Now, I could go d4 to stop e5, but bishop to b2 also stops e5 at the same time. Compared to the previous game, we're not worried about any kind of like f6 moves or anything like that. And once again, I'm not scripting these games. These are completely random games that are occurring on chess.com, but everybody's just giving us the e5 pawn. If you're in this rating range, I would say that this is probably one of the best openings you can play if your opponents are just going to give you pawns on the first, second, third, fourth moves of the game every time. I mean, why not do this and just take free pawns all day long? I think this is at least the fourth or fifth time in the I think we're in the third video now. Yeah, this is like the fourth or fifth time at least of the like 9 games or 8 games or something like that somebody's just giving us the pawn in the center for free. So we have no complaints here. We're just going to grab the pawn for free. And yeah, we're just happy with the extra pawn every single time they're going to give it to us. You might think that there's some kind of trap or trick that the opponent has, but quite honestly, in the large majority of these situations, you can just take the pawn for free. There's really not much to be concerned about. Okay, black plays knight to e4 in the center. We could simply retreat the bishop back to b2 if we wanted to play it a little bit cautiously, but I think we can just go ahead and play d3 as well, just to attack the knight and kick it backwards a bit. The only thing with d3 we have to be a little bit careful about is maybe bishop to b4 check occurs. But I think there we can play the move pawn to c3 because the pawn on c3 will be defended by both our bishop and our knight. So their bishop on b4 and our pawn on c3. I think it will be protected adequately. And also remember, if this bishop leaves the f8 square, we always want to be keeping an eye on the g7 pawn. So we might be able to pick up the pawn on g7 depending on what black does. So I think I'm just going to play d3 and hit the bishop. I'm not seeing any problems with it. I do have this undefended bishop I have to be a little bit careful about, but I can always drop it back to b2 in case I'm concerned about that. But I do think bishop b4 is probably the biggest concern, but I think we've got that covered with the pawn to c3 move here. We would not want to block with a piece because then black would be winning piece, a piece or multiple pieces in a position like that. That would be very bad for us. But yeah, we're just going to kick the knight backwards, and then we're going to continue with our development, try to get the king castled, have our extra pawn, and try to win the game using the extra material. Not really too much fanciness going on here, just converting the extra material that our opponent's giving us at the start of all of these games, as we're saying. So what is black going to do? They could try something like queen e7 or queen g5, some kind of counter-attacking move to hit our bishop in the center. I think if they do that, I'm probably just going to retreat the bishop back to b2 and keep it safe in most situations. If they try some kind of queen h4 threatening mate, we're going to eliminate the knight in the center. I don't think sacrificing the knight does much. They might have a couple of checks as a follow-up, but the extra piece should be very good for us as long as we play a little bit of defense at that point. So not entirely sure what black's going to do. If they retreat the knight, once again, I'll just focus on developing my other pieces. Knight to e4 kind of feels like a little bit of a, I don't know what I'm doing type of move. So I'm going to just try, I'm going to go knight e4 and bishop c5 and hope he doesn't see the f2 mate. Or queen h4 and attack f2, and I hope he doesn't see the threat on f2 type of situation. Probably what I think black should be doing instead is like grabbing space in the center, developing, castling, and there are some cases where black can get some compensation or some counterplay for the pawn that they lost. I don't think they're going to get enough in return for the lost pawn, but there are some situations for sure where black could, get some lead in development. They can definitely castle a bit quicker than us. So I don't think knight e4, though, is the way to do things here, because knight e4 just kind of feels like, we're going to kick the knight backwards, and then we're going to get the free time to develop stuff. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about what black could have done instead of playing e5. So probably what black should be doing instead of playing the move e5 is, they should go maybe e6, d5. You could go g6 and bishop g7, followed by castling. That looks perfectly good and solid. I think you could go d6 and try to play e5 safely. If black goes d6, we would probably go for d4 to prevent them from playing e5 easily. Against most moves that black will play here, I was planning on going g3, bishop g2, and castling. The only moves that we have to be a little bit careful about are that we don't want to let them play e5. So we'll play d4 against d6. And against almost anything else, we're going to go g6, g3, bishop g2, castle. Against d5, we could also go e3 and put the bishop on b5. That might actually have been an interesting idea as well, if they had played the move d5. But, yeah, playing e5 is not going to be so great, because, yeah, we just grabbed the pawn for free. Our opponent is still sitting and waiting. So, yeah, again, if they sit here for the next 4 minutes, I'll not make the viewers, suffer in terms of waiting. It does say says auto resign in 10 seconds. So we essentially get a 6-move win against a 800 rated player. 2, 1, and yep, there we get the win. Okay, pretty quick game in that regard. So again, just revisiting the start of the game: knight f3, knight f6, b3, knight c6, bishop b2. Again, like I said earlier during the game, I'm not scripting this. This is just random players playing on chess.com, and they're all giving us the e5 pawn. So if you want, to win free material in the opening, not to make this sound kind of like cheesy clickbait or cheesy advertisement, but we've seen it in a bunch of the games in the speedrun series so far. If you're around this rating level and you want to have a free pawn in the opening, a lot of people after knight f3, b3, bishop b2, they're just going to give you a free pawn on e5. So yeah, I think it's a very good opening in that regard. And then, you might even have opponents who just give up and disappear after 6 moves. So not a whole lot to say on this one. Let's go ahead and get in the next game. So we've got our third game here. We're playing against OTW Reg 24, rated 855. So we're going knight f3. They're going for d5. We're going for our normal b3 move at this point for our Reti Nimzo Larsen attack. Bishop to b2. And then once our bishop is developed, we will decide where we are going to put our light square bishop. So we are going to play bishop to b2 here. Black already has to be a little bit careful about the pressure on their g7 pawn. Wouldn't surprise me if some people that are playing this opening, or playing against this opening, do something like bishop c5 and simply lose the pawn on g7. We've seen some tactics along this diagonal in some of the other games. So here black plays the move knight h6. Now, it's a very odd move in my opinion. I'm really not entirely sure what black is going for with that particular move. I mean, knight f6 is a much better move in comparison. If anything, this still doesn't really fix the bishop problem. If black develops the bishop, they're still going to end up losing the pawn on g7. So I think against this, we could decide to put the bishop on g2. Usually you're going to commit the bishop to the g2 square, more so than developing it on the other diagonal, especially when black doesn't have a knight on c6 or a pawn on c5 just yet. That being said, I think I'm going to go for the move c4 before I do that, just to put some pressure on the center, start a little bit of conflict in the middle of the board, see what black does against this. Depending on how they play, we'll decide where the bishop is going to go. Again, though, they still can't really develop the dark square bishop just yet without losing the pawn on g7, so that's already something that that black has to be careful about. Okay, they end up taking the pawn. I'm going to recapture. The nice thing about this particular trade is that without the pawn on d5 anymore, black is left over with only one central pawn at this point, whereas we have two central pawns. We have both the d and e pawns. They only have the e pawn. And with that being said, we can already start thinking about ideas like d4, e4, just grabbing all of the space in the center of the board, especially when black has lost, the pawn that they did have previously in the center of the board. That being said, I'm not going to rush to play d4 yet. I don't want to block my bishop's diagonal just yet. I don't think I'm going to rush to play e4 either. I think I'm going to go for the g3 bishop g2. G3 bishop to g2 setup. And we're going to kind of make black decide how they're going to develop the king side before we put the pawn on d4 blocking the bishop. I also am not in a rush to play d4 when black can throw in this check. It's slightly annoying. So I'm going to get my bishop developed to g2 first, castle, and then depending on how black plays, then we might very well start, throwing the pawns in the center of the board, gaining a bunch of space. Does depend a little bit on what black does here. Now, I will also mention that usually when the d5 pawn is gone, in this case when it's traded off, the bishop on g2 does kind of pick up in power somewhat. If the pawn was on d5, the bishop on g2 is kind of staring into the pawn. Whereas now that the pawn is gone, when the bishop is on g2, it is on a much more open type of diagonal here, which is pretty nice. Okay, black played the move knight f5. They are protecting the pawn on g7. I think with that in mind, I think I'm just going to continue playing bishop to g2. Just stick with the plan. If the bishop moves off of the f8 square and kind of loses some of the protection of the g7 pawn, there might be ideas of e4 or g4 looking to have attacked that knight that was on f5 that was protecting the pawn. Here, though, black has played the move knight to d4. They are putting the knight in the center of the board. This is not going to stay there for very long, though, because we have the ability to simply trade the knights, and then we can play e3 to kind of just oust or kick the knight out of this d4 square. So I think we're going to just go for the trade. I could also go pawn to e3 first, which is also not a bad idea. Force black probably to take us. We recapture. And that also looks like a reasonable way of doing things. there could be some argument for that being even better than trading knights first. Um, yeah, so I think I'm going to go for that route. I don't really think there's anything all that wrong with trading knights to begin with, and then playing e3, but I kind of like the knight on c6 being kind of stuck in place. If we trade the knights and then play e3, let's say maybe the knight goes back to the f5 square, there is a scenario where black could put their pawn on the c6 square, and that would kind of block the diagonal that we have for our bishop. It's probably still a pretty good position for white, but I think I'm going to go for e3 first and kind of see what black does about that. So let's see. I'm just making sure there's no tricks or anything. Yeah, I think we're just going to go for this. If they take with the knight, I think we'll probably just recapture with the bishop and then castle the king and stuff like that. I think they kind of have to capture. I mean, if they want to go back to f5, I'm not unhappy about that situation. I would probably just go ahead and castle. Feels kind of weird for them to move the knight, 3 different times. They're going to move it a 4th time to take our knight, most likely. And our knight only moved 1 time. So we moved our knight once, they moved their knight 4 times. And then they're going to trade off their knight. So that kind of means that they lost 3 moves in the opening here. There's kind of like 3 moves for them that weren't all that useful or helpful. And so that's a pretty good situation for us. Now, the move f5 is a bit of an odd one in my opinion. It does open up this potential diagonal towards the opponent's king on e8. There are some checks with the bishop available. For instance, if I check right now and black plays pawn to g6, I could just simply take the rook in the corner. So this is looking pretty good. I think the king has to go to d7 or e7, and those are both pretty bad spots for the king to be stuck on. So I think I'm just going to make the check. I could also trade the pieces on c6 and then check with the queen. The slight difference there, though, is after the pawn pushes, my queen is hit, which is more valuable than the bishop on h5, so I wouldn't have time to take the rook on h8 right away. So with that being said, I think I am just going to check with the bishop. If they push the pawn, which they end up doing, they're missing or kind of forgetting, I guess you could say, that this diagonal was open, and now I'm able to take the rook on h8, and black is in very bad shape. They can grab my bishop, but I'm going to take back with the queen delivering a check, and black is going to be down a lot of material in this kind of position here. So the big problem that black gets themselves into in this game, number one, I think that they made some odd development. Okay, well, knight to e5 is also allowing me to take a free piece. The bishop does aim backwards from the h8 square. I still don't mind if black takes the bishop here, because I can take with check. Okay, they're simply not taking my bishop. Well, if they're not going to take my bishop, I am going to keep it safe. So let's retreat the bishop back to safety somewhere. I guess we can go back to... I guess we'll go back to the e2 square. And yeah, we're simply up a rook and a minor piece. So very large material advantage here. It's just going to be all about converting things. Probably going to castle, develop the knight, and probably just start pushing in the center to open up the middle of the board. Looks like a reasonable idea. So let's castle first. If they develop this bishop, we can also pick off the pawn on c7, which is what they do. Do I need to rush to grab this pawn? Not entirely sure. It does stop black from castling, though, so let's go for it. We might as well just grab an extra pawn. They do attack it with their rook. Let's go back to where we were just a moment ago, and we can always play d4 to reinforce the bishop, attacking the rook at the same time. If they take this pawn, that's not free to capture. My bishop is defending, and yeah, we're just grabbing all of the free material that they're giving to us. We can also take this pawn. And we can make this check, forking the king as well as the bishop. Remember, this was that diagonal that they opened up by pushing the pawn up to f5 in the first place, which was a bad decision. We can grab the bishop here. And yeah, I actually don't even really need to develop the queenside pieces. I'm kind of doing enough damage with the bishops and the queen that are on the board. But we probably will just develop the knight. maybe try to get the knight work its way into the d6 square or the f6 square. Both of those look quite dangerous. We're also threatening the pawn on g5. And yeah, black is in quite a lot of trouble here, of course. And okay, looks like the opponent ends up abandoning the game, and we get the win. So let's go back and analyze the opening and middle game. So knight f3, d5, b3, e6, bishop b2. All of this is pretty standard so far. Now the main move here by far is probably just to play knight f6, develop the bishop, castle the king, and black has a very solid position. If they do go for knight f6, I believe the move that we will go for is still this pawn to c4 type of idea. And once the bishop develops to e7, we have a little bit of an option. We can go for e3, we can go for g3. I think in this particular case, we would go for e3, knight c3, and develop that way. Yeah, it's a perfectly fine position, both for white and for black. I think black is very solid here, but white's also doing totally fine. But this knight h6 move was very odd. It's not like a losing move by any means, but it is a bit of a weird placement for the knight on the edge of the board. And the other thing, again, is that it's not blocking the diagonal towards the pawn on g7. So it still becomes difficult for black to develop their bishop without losing the pawn on g7 here. So I decided to strike at the center. They traded the pawns. Generally speaking, this trade of pawns is usually pretty good for white, because once again, black is losing out on one of their two central pawns, and we have the two central pawns we can push later. So they followed this up with knight to c6. We put the bishop on the g2 square. Knight to d4. I think given the circumstance, probably black should have played something like maybe, I don't know, bishop to c5, and then tried to castle the king. A position like this is probably okay for black, even though I would, prefer to be white here. Again, because of the space advantage, and our pieces are a little bit more harmoniously placed. The knight on f5 is still a little bit weird to me. But they decide to move the knight a 1, 2, 3, third time onto the d4 square. I went for e3. The trade occurs. And then f5 is quite bad. Probably, given the circumstance, I think black should try to do... if they're going to move the f-pawn, probably a pawn to f6 is a better option, because at least in this situation, if I do give the check on h5, they can block with the pawn on g6, since the pawn on f6 is still blocking the diagonal. So pawn to f6, then develop the bishop, then castle. Maybe the game would go something like this. And, okay, white's better because of the space advantage, but black is, kind of survived the worst of it. Let's put it that way. So f5, though, gets them into trouble. We checked on h5. g6 was a blunder that loses the rook in the corner. And then we just continued grabbing all of the free material. Grabbed this pawn, hit the rook, took the rook, just grabbed all the material, and the game was over here. Okay, so that was it for our third game for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed the 3 games that we saw here. And I will get back with you guys in the next episode of this particular series next week. And I hope you have enjoyed this video, and look forward to the next one.